The master's wife's sister ran into the ceremony. What the slave did next changed everything. On a bright spring morning in the 1800s, when church bells were ready to ring and white roses covered the chapel doors, something happened that no one in that town would ever forget. A young woman in a wedding dress ran straight into the ceremony before it could even begin. Her face was pale, her hands were shaking, and behind her followed whispers that could ruin lives. But it was not her entrance that shocked everyone. It was what the young slave did next. In one brave moment, he changed not only his fate, but hers too. This is a story about love that was never meant to happen. It is about fear, courage, and a choice made in front of a whole town. In those days, rules were strict, and lines between people were drawn in stone. A slave was expected to bow his head. A rich family's daughter was expected to marry well. No one imagined their paths would cross in a way that would shake everything. But sometimes the heart does not care about rules. Sometimes it chooses its own way. If you enjoy stories like this, make sure you stay with me till the end. The year was 1858. The Carter estate stood wide and proud on the edge of a small southern town. Cotton fields stretched far beyond the house, and many enslaved men and women worked from sunrise to sunset. Among them was a young man named Isaiah. He was strong, quiet, and known for keeping to himself. His eyes, however, always carried thought. He had learned to move carefully in a world that gave him little freedom. Inside the big house lived Margaret Carter, the master's wife. She was gentle in ways her husband was not. Visiting her often was her younger sister, Eleanor Whitmore. Eleanor was lively, curious, and not used to the harsh truths of plantation life. When Eleanor first saw Isaiah repairing a fence near the garden, something in her changed. She could not explain it. And Isaiah, though he tried not to look twice, felt something shift in his own heart. Neither of them understood that this simple glance would one day lead to a wedding no one expected, and a choice that would change everything. The days after that first meeting passed quietly, but something had changed. Eleanor Whitmore began finding small reasons to step outside in the late afternoons. She told her sister Margaret that she needed fresh air. She carried a book in her hand, pretending to read, though her eyes often drifted past the garden and toward the far fence. Isaiah noticed. He always kept his head down when members of the family were near. It was safer that way. But when Eleanor walked close, her soft shoes brushing the gravel, he felt her presence before he even looked up. One afternoon, as he fixed a loose gate near the orchard, Eleanor stopped a few steps away. "You work very hard," she said gently. Isaiah paused. Speaking too freely could bring trouble. "Yes, miss," he replied, careful and respectful. She hesitated. "What is your name?" He lifted his eyes just once. "Isaiah, miss." She repeated it softly, as if testing how it sounded. Isaiah. From the porch, Margaret watched the small exchange. She did not miss the way her sister's voice softened or the way Isaiah stood straighter than usual. That evening, Margaret called Eleanor into her sitting room. "You must be careful," Margaret said quietly. "People in this town see more than they say." Eleanor frowned. "I only asked his name." Margaret gave her a long look. That is how it begins. But Eleanor could not understand why kindness should be wrong. Over the next few weeks, their meetings became more frequent. They never spoke long. A few sentences at most. Sometimes about the weather. Sometimes about books Eleanor had read. Isaiah listened more than he talked. He had taught himself to read from old newspapers he found discarded. When Eleanor discovered this, her eyes widened with surprise. "You can read?" she asked. A little, he admitted. She began bringing him small scraps of paper with poems written on them. Nothing improper. Nothing that could cause alarm if found. But it was enough. A secret shared between them. Isaiah knew the danger. Every step toward her was a step toward punishment. He had seen men whipped for less. Yet something inside him refused to step back. One evening, as the sky turned orange and gold, Eleanor spoke in a lower voice than usual. "My father has arranged my marriage," she said. Isaiah felt the words like a stone dropping in his chest. He kept his face calm. "To someone from town?" "Yes, Thomas Whitaker. He owns land near the river." She forced a small smile. "The wedding is in a month." Isaiah nodded slowly. "That is good for you, miss." But his hands tightened around the fence rail. Eleanor stepped closer than she ever had before. "It is not good for me." Her voice trembled. Inside the house, Margaret again watched from a distance. She began to understand what was growing between them, and she feared what it could lead to. That night, Margaret approached Isaiah privately near the stables. "You must end this," she said softly but firmly. "You know what could happen." Isaiah lowered his head. "Yes, ma'am. My sister does not understand the world as it truly is. But you do." Her words were not cruel. They were honest. And honesty sometimes hurts more than anger. "I would never bring harm to her," Isaiah said quietly. "I know," Margaret replied. "That is what worries me." As wedding preparations filled the house, Eleanor felt trapped. White fabric arrived from the city. Invitations were sent. The church near town prepared for the ceremony. Everyone spoke of how beautiful she would look walking down the aisle. No one asked if she wanted to walk there at all. Late one evening, Eleanor slipped outside once more. The moon was bright. Isaiah stood near the barn, finishing his work. "I cannot marry him," she whispered. Isaiah looked at her, pain clear in his eyes. "You do not have a choice." Her chin lifted slightly. "There is always a choice." He shook his head. "Not for people like me." She stepped closer. "Then I will choose for both of us." He felt fear rise in his chest. "What are you saying?" But before she could answer, they heard footsteps on the gravel path. Thomas Whitaker himself had arrived early to visit his bride-to-be. He stopped when he saw them standing two near each other in the moonlight. His eyes narrowed. "Eleanor," he said slowly, "why are you out here?" Her face turned pale, but she did not step away from Isaiah. "I was getting air," she answered. Thomas looked at Isaiah with cold dislike. "You forget your place," he said sharply. Isaiah lowered his eyes again, though inside he burned with quiet anger. Thomas walked closer, his voice low but threatening. "If I see you near her again, there will be consequences." Eleanor's hand trembled at her side. She wanted to speak, to defend Isaiah, but she knew it would only make things worse. The tension in the air felt heavy enough to break. As Thomas led Eleanor back toward the house, she glanced over her shoulder at Isaiah. In her eyes was something stronger than fear. It was decision. The wedding day was now only 2 weeks away, and in Eleanor's heart, a plan had already begun to form. The morning of the wedding arrived bright and warm. The small white church at the edge of town was covered in flowers. Neighbors gathered early, dressed in their best clothes. Horses and carriages lined the road. Laughter filled the air. Inside the Carter house, Eleanor stood in front of a tall mirror. Her wedding dress flowed around her like soft clouds. Lace covered her shoulders. Her hair was pinned carefully beneath a delicate veil. She looked beautiful, but her eyes told a different story. Margaret stood behind her, adjusting the fabric. "You still have time," Margaret whispered gently, "if you wish to speak now." Eleanor swallowed. Will anyone truly listen? Margaret had no answer. Outside, Isaiah stood among the other enslaved workers near the church grounds. He had been ordered to assist with the horses and help guests if needed. He kept his distance, his face calm, but inside his heart felt heavy. He had not seen Eleanor in 3 days. The church bell rang once. Guests began taking their seats. Thomas Whitaker stood at the front, proud and confident, speaking to the minister. He had no doubt about what the day would bring. Inside a small room behind the chapel, Eleanor's hands trembled. A maid reached for her bouquet. "It is time." Eleanor closed her eyes. She remembered the orchard, the small scraps of poetry, the way Isaiah listened when she spoke, as if her words truly mattered. She opened her eyes again, and something inside her settled. "No," she said quietly. The maid blinked. "Yes." Eleanor lifted her skirt slightly and walked past her. At first, the maid thought she was heading toward the aisle. But instead, Eleanor turned sharply and hurried toward the back door of the chapel. Outside, a few workers looked up in surprise as she stepped into the sunlight in her full wedding dress. Gasps rose from nearby guests. Margaret, standing near the church entrance, saw her sister rush out and felt her breath catch. "Eleanor," she called softly. But Eleanor was already running. The lace of her gown brushed against the grass. Her veil loosened in the wind. She did not stop. Across the yard, Isaiah froze. He could hardly believe what he was seeing. Eleanor, dressed for marriage, running straight toward him. People began to murmur loudly. Some stepped forward, confused. Others whispered in shock. Thomas came storming out of the church. "What is the meaning of this?" he shouted. Eleanor reached Isaiah, her chest rising quickly from the run. Her face was pale but steady. "Isaiah," she said, her voice clear enough for those nearby to hear. "I cannot marry him." Silence fell over the yard. Isaiah looked at her, fear and disbelief fighting inside him. "You must go back," he whispered urgently. "You do not know what you are doing." "I know exactly what I am doing," she replied. Thomas pushed through the small crowd, anger burning in his eyes. "You will return inside this instant," he demanded. Eleanor turned to face him, her white dress glowing under the sun. "No." Gasps echoed again. "This is madness," Thomas snapped. "You shame your family." "My family will survive," she said softly. "But I will not survive a life I did not choose." Thomas's gaze shifted toward Isaiah. "You," he said coldly. "You filled her head with foolish ideas." Isaiah stepped back slightly. "No, sir, I did not." It was true. He had never asked her for this. Thomas raised his hand as if to strike Isaiah, but before he could move further, Margaret stepped between them. "That is enough," she said firmly. The crowd stood frozen, unsure of what would happen next. Eleanor reached for Isaiah's hand. That single touch felt louder than any shout. "You once told me there is no choice for people like you," she said quietly. "Then let today be the day that changes." Isaiah's heart pounded. He knew the risk. If they ran, they could be chased. If they stayed, he could be punished harshly. But when he looked into her eyes, he saw no fear, only trust. Thomas turned to the minister. "Call the sheriff," he ordered. The word hung heavy in the air. Margaret leaned close to Isaiah and whispered quickly, "There is a horse behind the stable. Take it." "No!" Isaiah hesitated only for a second. Then he made his choice. He stepped forward, lifted Eleanor gently into his arms, wedding dress and all, and carried her toward the back field. The crowd broke into loud cries. Some shouted in anger. Others simply stared in shock. Thomas yelled for men to stop them, but the moment of surprise had slowed everyone down. Isaiah reached the horse Margaret had prepared. He helped Eleanor up first, her white gown spilling over the dark saddle. Then he climbed up behind her. "Hold tight," he said softly. As the horse surged forward, the church bells began ringing wildly, though no one had touched them. Dust rose behind them as they rode toward the tree line. Eleanor did not look back. Isaiah did not slow down. Behind them, the wedding that was meant to unite two powerful families fell apart before it had even begun. And in that single bold moment, everything changed. The sound of hoofs faded into the trees, but the noise behind them did not. Shouts filled the churchyard. Thomas Whitaker's voice rose above the rest, sharp and furious. Men rushed toward their horses. Some guests stood frozen, hands covering their mouths. Others whispered that they had just witnessed something that would be talked about for years. Margaret remained standing near the church steps. Her face was calm, but her heart was racing. She knew what she had done by helping them. There would be questions. There would be anger. But deep down, she felt something else too, relief. Inside the forest, Isaiah did not slow the horse until the church and the estate were far behind them. The trees grew thick. Branches brushed against Eleanor's veil until it slipped off completely and fell into the leaves behind them. Eleanor held tightly to the saddle. Her white dress was no longer neat. Dust marked the edges. Her breathing was quick, but she did not cry. She did not regret. After several miles, Isaiah guided the horse off the main path and into a narrow trail known only to workers who moved between fields. Finally, when he felt safe enough, he slowed to a stop near a small creek hidden by tall trees. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The world felt quiet there. Only the sound of water moving over stones. Isaiah climbed down first and helped Eleanor carefully to the ground. She stood in her wedding dress in the middle of the forest. No guests, no music, no ceremony. Only freedom and danger. "You should not have done this," Isaiah said softly, though there was no anger in his voice. Eleanor looked at him with steady eyes. "If I had stayed, I would have lost myself." He shook his head slightly. "They will search. Thomas will not rest. I know. And if they catch us—" He did not finish the sentence. She stepped closer. "Then we face it together." Isaiah had lived his whole life thinking only of survival, keeping quiet, staying unseen, enduring. He had never imagined someone choosing him openly, in front of a whole town. It scared him, but it also gave him strength he did not know he had. Back at the Carter estate, chaos had taken over. Thomas demanded answers. He accused Margaret of knowing more than she admitted. Servants were questioned. Riders were sent in different directions. Master Carter, stern and embarrassed, ordered men to search every road toward the river. "This will not stand," Thomas repeated again and again. But as the hours passed, no one found them. By nightfall, Isaiah and Eleanor had reached an old abandoned cabin deep within the woods. It had once belonged to a worker who had passed away years before. The roof was worn but still solid. Inside, dust covered the small wooden table and narrow bed. Eleanor stepped inside slowly, taking in her new surroundings. This is not the life you were raised for, Isaiah said gently. She turned to him. It is the life I choose. He gathered firewood while she carefully lifted the heavy layers of her wedding dress. The lace that once looked perfect now seemed out of place in the small cabin. She laughed softly, almost in disbelief. I must look foolish, she said. No, Isaiah answered quietly. You look brave. They shared a simple meal Isaiah had packed in a small cloth bag before the ceremony. Dried meat, water from the creek. It was not much, but it was theirs. That night, as the forest grew dark, Eleanor sat near the small fire. Where will we go? She asked. Isaiah stared into the flames. North! The word carried hope and fear at the same time. Will it be easy? She asked. No, he said honestly. Nothing about this will be easy. She nodded. I did not expect easy. Back in town, whispers spread quickly. Some people spoke of Eleanor as reckless. Others secretly admired her courage. A few even questioned the fairness of the rules that had been broken. Margaret faced her husband's anger quietly. You helped them, he accused. I helped my sister, she replied calmly. You have shamed this family. Margaret lifted her chin slightly. Perhaps this family needed to feel shame. Her words stunned him into silence. Days passed. The search slowly weakened. No clear trail had been found. Some believed the couple had drowned crossing the river. Others believed they had fled far beyond reach. Thomas Whitaker refused to give up easily. But pride can only burn so long before it turns into quiet bitterness. Meanwhile, Isaiah and Eleanor traveled mostly at night. They avoided towns. They followed smaller paths and trusted the help of kind strangers when they were lucky enough to meet them. Eleanor traded her wedding dress for simpler clothes given by a farmer's wife who asked no questions. The white lace was folded and left behind at the cabin, a reminder of the life she had walked away from. One evening, as they rested beneath a wide oak tree, Eleanor looked at Isaiah with a thoughtful expression. Do you regret it? She asked gently. He thought carefully before answering. I regret that the world made this dangerous, he said. But I do not regret choosing you. Tears filled her eyes, not from sadness, but from relief. Months later, far from the town they once knew, they reached a small free community near the northern border. It was not grand. Houses were simple. Life was still hard. But no one there owned another human being. For the first time, Isaiah walked without fear of being called back. For the first time, Eleanor worked beside him not as a visitor, but as his equal. The wedding that never happened became a distant story carried by rumors. But the choice made that day, in front of a church filled with expectations, had opened a new life neither of them had been promised. And though the path ahead remained uncertain, it was finally their own. The first winter in the northern community was not gentle. Snow covered the small wooden houses, and cold winds slipped through tiny cracks in the walls. Isaiah worked long hours cutting wood and helping build fences. Eleanor learned quickly how to cook simple meals over a small stove and mend clothes by hand. Life was harder than the one she had known in the big house. There were no servants, no silk dresses, no polished floors. But every night, when she sat beside Isaiah near the fire, she felt something she had never felt before. Peace. The people in the community did not ask many questions. They had all come from somewhere painful. Some were once enslaved. Some had run from homes that no longer felt safe. Everyone carried a story. Isaiah slowly began to open up. For the first time in his life, He spoke freely about his dreams. He wanted to learn more, to read more books, to build something of his own. Eleanor listened with pride. "You will," she told him. "Now nothing stands in your way." One evening, a traveler passed through their town. He carried news from the south. News traveled slowly, but it still traveled. Isaiah sat quietly as the man spoke. "The Carter estate," the traveler said. "It's not the same. There was trouble after the wedding that never happened. Business suffered. Thomas Whitaker sold part of his land. People still whisper about the day the bride ran." Eleanor felt a small ache in her chest. Not regret, just memory. "And Margaret?" she asked carefully. The traveler smiled faintly. "Your sister?" She surprised many people. She has begun speaking openly about fair treatment for workers. Some call her bold. Some call her foolish. But she does not seem to care. Eleanor lowered her eyes, holding back tears. She had always known Margaret carried quiet strength. Later that night, as snow fell softly outside, Isaiah turned to Eleanor. "Do you ever wish to go back?" he asked. She looked at him with steady calm. "There is nothing for me there," she said gently. "Everything I wanted is here." He reached for her hand. Spring arrived slowly, but when it did, it brought new beginnings. Isaiah found work helping a local carpenter. His skill with his hands impressed many. Eleanor began teaching young children in the small community how to read and write. She used the same simple poems she once carried secretly to the orchard. The past did not disappear completely. There were moments when fear returned, when a stranger rode too slowly through town, or when distant news from the south reminded them of the risks they had taken. But each time fear tried to return, they faced it together. One afternoon, nearly a year after the wedding day, Isaiah built something special. It was a small wooden frame house at the edge of town. Not large, not grand, but built with care. He sanded each board himself. He shaped each window frame with patience. When it was finished, he stood beside Eleanor and looked at it quietly. "This is ours," he said. She smiled, her eyes shining. Not long after, they gathered a few close friends from the community. No grand church, no silk dress, no loud bells. Just simple clothes, open sky, and people who wished them well. There, under a wide blue sky, Isaiah and Eleanor spoke vows to each other. No one forced them. No one arranged it. It was their choice. And this time, when Eleanor walked forward, it was not to escape something. It was to step fully into the life she had chosen. Years later, stories of the runaway bride still traveled through the South. Some told it with anger, some with disbelief, but a few told it with quiet admiration. They spoke of the day a young woman in a white dress ran into a ceremony and chose love over comfort. They spoke of the young man who dared to ride away with her, knowing the risks. But what most people never knew was what happened after. They did not see the cold winters turned warm by shared laughter. They did not see the simple home built board by board. They did not see the children Eleanor taught, or the respect Isaiah earned with his honest work. They did not see the quiet joy. And sometimes, the quiet joy matters more than the loud scandal. Years passed, and the story of that wedding day escape became a legend whispered among neighbors. Children grew up hearing about the brave young woman in white who had run toward freedom, and the young man who had dared to ride beside her, risking everything for love. Isaiah and Eleanor built a life full of simple happiness. Their home, though small, was warm and full of laughter. They grew stronger together with every challenge, supporting each other in ways no one in their past could understand. Eleanor's teaching touched many young lives, and Isaiah's skill and honesty earned him respect and a quiet pride he had never imagined. They never returned to the South, but letters sometimes came from Margaret, filled with hope and encouragement. It reminded them that family could be both a chain and a lifeline, depending on courage and choice. And so, the runaway bride and the young man who followed her into the unknown found something that mattered more than wealth, status, or fear. They found freedom, love, and a life entirely their own, a life that began the moment they chose each other over everything else. Their story was proof that sometimes the boldest step, even into danger, leads to the most lasting happiness.